Good. There
Go
we
ahead.
go. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, everybody at the Bangor Land Trust. I'm so grateful for this opportunity to talk about Coyote, our native song dog here in Maine. I am also just so grateful for the Coyote Center for Carnivore Ecology and Coexistence. The founder, Jerry Vistine, has been such a huge help for me throughout this whole year, doing so much work with her, but also so much work just researching in this presentation. So just have to give that shout out as well. And yeah, so we have a lot to cover. I've got a lot to talk about, but I've been really excited about this. This took me a while to put together, but it's been so much fun. So I'm so excited to get to share it with everybody. Okay, without further ado, let's begin.
One
So
more. So sorry. One more thing I forgot to mention, just because we do have a lot of participants today, we are going to have time for Q&A at the end. But please put your questions in the chat. That way it can be a little bit less chaotic when we get to the Q&A. So feel free to drop them in the chat at any time and we will address them at the end. So sorry for interrupting you, Nola. Go ahead.
fine, I get it. I also totally forgot about that. Okay, great. So we'll be talking a bit about Coyote's journey at length today. I wanted to set this slide up a little bit like a timeline of my journey because I wanted to talk a bit about how I got to doing this. And I think it's really important to just recognize that sometimes the natural science work comes to us in really unexpected ways. So for me, I studied creative writing. Actually, my background is in writing and communication, and it was through a lot of those classes that I started learning about ecological literature and was just really fascinated with the stories that we tell each other about ourselves and about our relationship with nature. This really just like sparked so many just wide ranges of interests for me. And that led me into during 2020, especially when being outside was all of the rage. I started really getting into mushroom foraging and learning about organic farming and using the natural system of things in terms of gardening and things like that. And so when I graduated in 2021, that's when I was able to save up a little bit of money and take a little bit of a break working and traveling. So I volunteered a lot. I also did some, low wage jobs at different lodges and things like that. This was about like 2 years or so that I did this. But it really helped me get a perspective of like local people doing local work with their land and telling stories also about the land that they were working with as well as the people around them and like the history of a place and what that meant to them. All of that was just really fascinating to me. And it spoke to me and it touched a lot on the experiences that I had doing my minor in WGS, that stands for Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. So I studied a lot of sociopolitics, but that was when I really started to see the intersection between sociopolitics and environmental justice. And I really wanted to talk a lot about this because combined with my interest in psychology and mental health, I started to see, especially when I started learning about the ways that trauma manifests in ourselves, as well as it has this biological and an evolutionary basis. I started to see, in all of these stories and everything, seeing how humans are more like complicated animals rather than thinking about animals as simplified humans. And that really all just kind of shaped my writing and my experiences since then. So coming back to Maine in 2022, 2023, I started the Maine Master Naturalist program, and I really wanted to have more under my belt in terms of like ecological science, so that I could do volunteering like this, and so that I could talk to people about really important and amazing things that impact our social world as well as our ecological world, our natural world. And that's also kind of how I fell into talking about coyotes and talking about coyote ecology, because this was almost something that kind of happened by happenstance or by accident, in that it started with Jerry and one of the other Maine master naturalists, Bonnie, reaching out and needing somebody to give a testimony at a hearing for a bill to protect coyotes and whatnot. And we'll talk about that later. But it just kind of started as something that I was like, yeah, like I could do that, that seems nice. It seems like a good way to learn something new and also to do something that I care about. And through that, I ended up learning so much and becoming just fully entrenched in this research and really loving everything that I've been learning. So it's been sort of a long and winding road, but I got here because of just kind of following my interests, and now I'm getting to do this presentation, and yeah, so it's just I just wanted to share that just because it's been a very unconventional way to get here, but then I got here nonetheless, and I'm just so grateful to be able to do that. I also, you'll see me flipping through this. These are all my notes that I needed to print out because I needed the physical notes in front of me. But yeah, so I didn't want to take too much time talking about myself, but I just wanted to share just how, uh, my journey here was unconventional, but it's just taught me so much, and now I'm getting to do incredible things like this. So yeah, and I also briefly wanted to just give a short land acknowledgement, even though this is a online talk. I wanted to just express, especially because I know I'm going to be talking a little bit later about Indigenous wisdom, that I wanted to just express, Maine is the homeland of the Wabanaki tribal nations. As we will talk a little bit more later, the indigenous peoples of North America have stewarded this land for over 12,000 years. And some estimates are closer to 20,000 years. And I wanted to share my gratitude for all of the work that these indigenous stewards have done to preserve these lands for future generations, so that we can all enjoy them and also join in the tradition of stewardship and interconnectedness with nature. So my goal today is really just to highlight the multiple perspectives that contribute to our understanding of the natural world and of Coyote, and specifically to uplift the voices of those that maybe have not always been heard or understood fully, like the voice of the Coyote as well. So, briefly, every living creature on the planet is interconnected. A lot of us maybe know this, maybe don't. And through this interconnectedness, create these complex webs of relationships with each other that form our ecosystems. And one relationship that I'm really interested in, that I've become more interested in this year, is the predator-prey relationship, which shapes so much of our biology. I mean, even human biology is shaped by it. That's why we're really good at running long distances, as well as just our ability to our socialness as well. That's something that shaped our human biology as well as coyotes' biology. And these interconnected elements really shaped how the coyote came to be who Coyote is now. And so yeah, there was okay, yeah, I think that was the last thing on that point. Okay, great. Yeah, okay. I was like, just gotta get my bearings here. But okay, so let's talk about where Coyote is. So Coyote has been around for 5 million years. For reference, Homo sapiens have been around for 250,000 years. So they have been around for longer than humans have been humans. And it wasn't until about 20,000 years ago that the coyote crossed the Bering Strait over into the North American continent and settled into basically where you see the circle now, in the southwestern area of the continent, all the way down to Mexico. But pretty much the whole western half from like the Mississippi westward, coyote had been primarily for the last 20,000 years. They had been adopted from canines that came from like the Russian Asian continent, and but they were also so well able to adapt, that they were easily able to settle into the temperate and warmer regions here. Their territories can be up to, I believe, somewhere around 30 square miles. Sometimes it's as, as little as 5. But historically, it's been up to 30 square miles, and they're primarily, a lot of who they are is also built around being able to protect their territory. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail, but I just wanted to share here, that in their territory, their habitat is, it's interesting because they build dens like a lot of canids do, but their dens are primarily just used for pup rearing. Their pups are the ones that primarily stay in their dens. They will stay there until they're about 8 to 10 weeks old, until they eventually are brought out to a rendezvous site where they start to learn how to hunt more independently. And after the pup rearing season is done, their territory becomes their home in a way that is not, it's not like they build a separate nest or a dwelling. Their whole territory is their home. And I just thought that was really interesting because it's thinking about their whole territory like we think about our houses. Is just really, really fascinating to me. So that's a little bit about where they are. Now, who is Coyote biologically? There's a bunch of different things that we could talk about, but the main things I wanted to explore were their teeth and nose, the way that their teeth are shaped for grinding meat primarily. So a lot of carnivores have these sharp teeth. We see it with our own dogs, with our own cats. Fur, primarily is meant for insulation, especially in the colder climates. We will see in the southwestern and the more temperate areas, their fur will actually be a lot shorter. And so there is some variation just in terms of where they are. Exactly what they look like is really dependent on where they are as well. It's really shaped by their environment. And yeah, their sense of smell is, I couldn't find a lot of figures to compare it to, but they are usually able to smell you in terms of like, if you see a coyote, usually the coyote has known about you for several miles at this point, and is well aware of that you are there. And most of the time you won't see them because a lot of um their method, in terms of just staying safe, and avoiding conflict, is just going around, and finding new paths. And so that's a little bit about their morphology. Oh, and I did want to talk more in depth a bit about their tracks and their paws. These were some track guides that I got from the Maine Master Naturalist program that I thought were just really helpful, just in terms of kind of comparing, especially because I think for most of us, especially in like the southern part of the state, we're not really going to see a lot of wolves. So really, we're just trying to distinguish coyote from really domestic dogs, and I do wish they did have that specifically in here. But coyote are going to be generally slightly bigger than domestic dogs, but not always. Sometimes they can be roughly the same size. It depends on the breed. And in terms of foxes, they're obviously going to be bigger, and their paws are going to be a lot more. Their toes are going to be a lot more pointed. Their nails will be a little bit longer. Their claws are mainly for traction, and helps them just gain traction while they're running, and especially just helps sustain them for long periods, especially if they have big territories to cover. And yeah, so these tracks, especially, the places in Maine, the northern areas may see some gray wolf activity. There have been some reports of sightings recently, though most of them are going to be in Canada. The gray wolf's going to be a lot bigger, so even just measuring how big it is going to be a big tell for what you're looking at. But I wanted to share that just so we all have a little bit more of a basis of who they are biologically, and if we were to come across some tracks, in the woods or something like that, you might be able to get a better sense of what you're looking at. And if you happen to see coyote tracks, then you'll know what you're looking for. So briefly, I mentioned a little bit earlier about dispersal and mating. So in their territories, once the pups are able to disperse from their families, which can be, anywhere from like 10 weeks to months older, it depends. They are they usually are doing a varied dispersal, so they'll go at different times. They're not going to go all at the same time, and that's usually an individual sort of decision. But this actually helps promote healthier coyotes and healthier mates because there's going to be an age difference, there's going to be a genetic difference. It's just more likely that they're going to come across individuals that are more different, that are at least genetically different enough. So that's something that really helps in terms of that. And also it makes sure that there's not too many coyotes being born at one time. So that also just helps in terms of like food availability and things like that. So it's just the social aspects of their lives are really fascinating to me, and that's just one small part of it that I wanted to mention, just because I think it's so fascinating. Um, and coyote parents are also they're monogamous; they'll mate for life, and they also are a team. So when they're raising their young, they're raising them together the whole time, and they take turns hunting, take turns feeding the pups. And yeah, that time can be anywhere from all the way from the beginning of spring to the end of summer. So it's a really long period of time that they're really dedicated to their pups, to their families. So yeah, which segues really well into who are coyote socially. Who is the coyote to another coyote, to other packs? What about to wolves or to dogs or to other species? So there's a lot of interesting things that we could talk about here, but I first wanted to talk about who they are to each other. And so we're going to just imagine that we have followed some coyote tracks, potentially. Maybe they're in a little bit of snow. Um, and perhaps, we come around dusk, we take a little bit of a break. We're just sitting in the woods. Maybe there's a stream nearby. And we're just listening to the sounds of the woods at dusk. And we happen to hear some voices, and I'll play it for you. coyote howl for a lot of different reasons, and there's a couple of reasons that we might have heard them howl. One of them is that they communicate with each other, and usually, if they're communicating in terms of like a hunting situation, they'll be a lot quieter than that. They're not going to just give away their location if they're hunting. It's they're usually a lot quieter if they're going to be making any communication with each other in an active like hunting scenario. And Most of the time they don't make a lot of noise, especially near human settlements, but most of the time they're really quiet. So the times that they are loud is actually when they're celebrating. And a lot of times this is in the context of celebrating maybe a successful hunt, or maybe there's, a family dispersal happening of some sort. But a lot of times it's their way of expressing gratitude um, for um, for good food, for good friends, kind of like how we express gratitude at Thanksgiving. And we'll hear them, have these like raucous celebrations, especially those tinier yips. You can really tell there's like the smaller pups that are joining in once their parents start going. It's just this kind of expression of joy and excitement. And then it'll go quiet as if they're eating dinner, which is kind of like how it is at my house also during the holidays. But there's there's this recognition of gratitude and excitement that's just so beautiful to see and to hear. Especially I wish I could hear them more where I live, honestly. But this recording was just beautiful for me too. And I also want to talk about who they are with other species. So a lot of the animals that they come across in wild spaces, it varies depending on where they're at. In Maine, it's typically going to be bobcats and lynx, um, and occasionally the gray wolf. Though, as I said, they're a little more rare, and they're usually only in northern Maine. But there are the possibilities that they have these encounters, and these are also other carnivores um, that mark territory as well. So there's this sort of territorial relationship that they have, where they try to keep a respectable distance. Um, and of course, they're also going to come across the domestic dog, especially nowadays. Though historically, they had no context for what a domestic dog was really. We'll talk a little bit later about Native American cultures and tribes, but typically there wasn't a lot of animal domestication. And so the concept of dog being man's best friend and that whole thing, much later concept. It really wasn't something that they encountered a lot, but they definitely encountered and continue to encounter a lot of bobcat and lynx, specifically in Maine. And Yeah, they do a lot to maintain their territories, typically in the form of howling, and urination or scent marking. So they really don't do fighting, they don't do wars, they don't do the conflict. It's not worth wasting their time and energy on. So even with other carnivores like this, a lot of it is going to be communicated verbally or with scent. And there are very little, like individual to individual like fighting. And Yeah, so they really, yeah, like it's more about maintaining their territory from a distance, and just conserving their energy as much as possible. Um, the wolves in particular, they historically were able to keep a lot of their territory separate, but there was some overlap, and there still definitely continues to be overlap to this day. Um, and there have been a lot of cases also with in it's hard to say numbers wise around here, but there have been cases of interbreeding with coyotes and wolves, so there is some hybrids out there as well, and also with domestic dogs in some cases. Though the numbers on that are also a little bit fuzzy, but yeah, so there's been some connection with them, and there's definitely, it's not that conflict never happens, but they really do try to just avoid conflict at all costs. And when it comes to domestic dogs, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but something that has been reported recently that helps us give a little bit more context in terms of coyote behavior is this escorting behavior that they do sometimes, where they will follow an individual, usually another canid or some, especially if they're not sure if they're competition, if they're a threat, um, and especially if this individual is going through their territory, they will do this sort of escorting behavior of just kind of walking behind them and just sort of slowly ushering them out of their place, like, okay, you've overstayed your welcome, now please leave. Um, but it's again another way of just avoiding conflict. It's more of this way of just saying like, hey, I'm here, this is my territory, just letting you know, like, I just want to make sure that everybody's okay and that my pups are okay. Yeah, as I was doing research and hearing stories of people saying like, oh, I was walking my dog and there was a coyote that was following us and I wasn't sure what was happening. There are these similar anecdotes, and it all kind of falls right in line with this escorting behavior of them just being like, hey, this is my territory, letting you know. So keep your distance. And everything will be all good. And that's I just think that's so sweet. One of the things that I also really wanted to highlight here too that I found while I was doing research was this example of coyotes, especially in the Southwest. We don't have really badgers here in Maine, but in the Southwest, there have been a lot of examples of coyote and badgers being friendly with each other. And I just wanted to share this video that I found. It's just a really short, like 12-second clip, um, just of them greeting each other. The coyote's like, "Come on, you gotta go find rodents to eat." He's like, "Okay, I'll come along." He hobble down. I just think that's so cute. Um, And okay, yeah, I just needed to show that just because it also just really goes to highlight just how intelligent Coyote is. They are just incredible in terms of being able to recognize, I mean, difference, of course, between threats and friends, but then also being able to, I mean, like this Coyote, if they wanted to, could easily like attack the Badger. Like that's not, out of the realm of possibility. But it doesn't have to. And it's also found a way to make friends with them, which I just think is so sweet. I think we also see it with even domestic dogs too, being able to make friends with animals across the species divide. And I just wanted to highlight that here because it really just it goes to show how social and how even compassionate Coyote can be sometimes. So with that being said, now we can talk a little bit more about who they are ecologically. We're kind of slowly stepping out a little bit more. Um, and so this is why Coyote is considered a keystone species. They basically touch everything in the ecosystem. They're at every trophic level, trophic level being every level of like the food web. We see Coyote having some impact. And so we see, primarily their role with their rodent control leads into a lot of their other benefits in terms of what they offer the ecosystem, which is their ecosystem services. Um, they primarily eat rodents. The rodents are the large portion of their diet. And because of that, they control rodent populations. They also are able to control diseases that are spread from rodents and from deer as well, but the tick-borne diseases especially ride on both deer and rodents as well. So that relationship that they have with them is really important in terms of managing disease, and managing Lyme disease specifically. We see a really close correlation between coyote populations and tick-borne diseases in general, where if there's more coyotes, there's generally less Lyme. And there's also less brainworm, which is a disease that is spread through deer specifically. I wrote herbivore, but through deer. It's a disease that can be spread between deer as well as between ungulates like deer. So that includes alpacas, that can also spread to certain other farm animals like goats and sheep. And horses as well. So they're really also helping mitigate the disease spread in general, which is not only helpful to humans, of course, but it's also helpful to deer, actually. So it sounds counterintuitive, but actually, the healthier a coyote population is, the healthier a deer population is also going to be, even though they have, the direct predator-prey relationship. Because the coyote is helping to mitigate the spread of these diseases, it means that these deer are going to be healthier and more robust. And it also makes sure that the deer are kept in check, because if we don't have, and herbivores in general, right? They do eat just a lot of different herbivores, rodents, um, and through being able to keep those herbivores on the move, especially deer, from overgrazing, they actually protect a lot of habitat for pollinators, for native birds and insects. It's really, important for them to be able to do this work and to also be able to, have these established territories where they're able to cover a lot of land, because they're doing this work for everywhere that they go, right? Like, these are sort of integral to how they function, as a species. But it's really just invaluable to the landscape. Like, without them, the landscape would not look the way it is, right? Like, if without them, there would be a lot of overgrowth, there would be a lot of overpopulation, there would be a lot of Lyme disease. And we see this relationship the same way that coyote has this relationship with the Maine landscape. For those of us who know about the wolves in Yellowstone, it is almost identical in terms of the situation where, the way that, and for those of you that don't know, when we were seeing the extirpation of wolves, we saw that the rivers actually changed, because there were so many deer that were standing at the edge drinking the water, and slowly pressing down and feeding off of the banks of the river, and it led to more flooding. It led to the diverging of the rivers, and all of these indirect, effects really led to massive changes to their landscape. And so it's the exact same thing with coyote. They have such an integral role in just the way that the landscape is shaped, that without them, we would not have the same world that we do now. And yeah, so it's just that was one of the first things that I really learned about coyote that really stuck with me, and I think really just opened up my perspective in terms of who they are and what they do for us. So yeah, so a keystone species are just such incredible work, and we just have so much to be grateful for. And so now I'm really excited to get to talk about who is coyote to humans. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that they have been coexisting with the indigenous communities for, at the very least, 12,000 years, at most at least 20,000 years. But there is some evidence to suggest that indigenous people may have taken a little bit longer to get to Maine specifically. So it's quite possible that Coyote has been here even longer than indigenous peoples have, but they still have such an integrated relationship. And I wanted to highlight the fact that they also had, of course, many stories about Coyote. And actually, the term Coyote comes from a Aztec term, I believe it's Aztec, that is Coyotl, and it translates to God's dog, because the ancient peoples believed that Coyote was a messenger between the gods and the people. They saw them as this sort of transient, um, uh, what's it called? Almost liminal being in terms of being able to go back and forth between the worlds, between the realms. And sometimes they were also associated, especially in the Southwest, with music, because we heard their howling earlier, how they have these beautiful songs, and that's where we get the term songdog. And sometimes and it's also where we get a little bit of their association with being sort of a trickster. But almost always there's this benevolent association with this trickster identity. A lot of the time it is this sort of messenger, and this that also leads into the other definition of coyote that gets ascribed to people helping migrants go between countries and between borders. It is the same association. And they told a lot of stories about Coyote. And a lot of them, especially talked about Coyote as a species that was willing to help those who were lost or injured in in the woods, especially in the Southwest. There were a lot of stories of coyote, someone being lost, and a coyote coming across them, and actually waiting with them until help eventually arrived, or sometimes they even, if they were close enough, were able to find the human settlement and go there and get help. There were a lot of stories of this happening, and whether or not this is something that is still continuing to happen, there's some anecdotes of people having these experiences, even to this day, with coyote in the woods, having these really interesting moments with them where they're going out of their way to be compassionate to uh, another person, another human being, another animal, when they really just they don't have to. And there was also this other quote that I wanted to share because the it just it spoke to, I think, the reason why the native peoples saw coyote the way that they did. And this is actually a much more recent quote. It's from Coyote America by Dan Flores, and it talks about a researcher, and it says, once in his Yellowstone research of coyotes, Adolph Murray had stood rapt, watching a coyote trot along a trail with a sprig of sagebrush in its mouth. At repeated intervals, it had tossed the sprig joyously into the air, caught it, and trotted on, an animal that took such pleasure of being alive in the world. If we look at this purely from a scientific perspective, we notice how animals, like most carnivores, engage in this playful sort of behavior. And you could say that there's this sort of training of coordination skills or hunting skills, or they're using their muscles. And there's, I'm sure there's some element of that too. But what I love about this is that it also expresses the fact that they have fun, they play. And that really it speaks to this word that I learned recently from the founder of the Coyote Center, telos, which is the freedom to be who you are and follow the vision of your life how you're meant to. This is a Greek word, an ancient Greek word, but it speaks to this element of Coyote's life that is completely it's outside of the biological needs, even the ecological needs, right? It is just them doing what they want to do with their freedom and using their freedom how they want to. And I think this element of telos in their life is something that the native peoples understood, even if they didn't call it that. This idea of having this freedom and having it be inherent to one's life, no, regardless of species or gender or whatever, is just it really speaks to just how how intelligent these creatures are, as well as just how multifaceted they are. And this is something that we can really start to see for ourselves too, and see the personality that they can have. Um, but first we have to understand the type of the worldview that kind of encompasses all of this. And that is, we're seeing this ultimately a lot of these stories through the lens of indigenous cultures, right? And I wanted to explore a little bit more of what that worldview looks like and what the worldview was that shaped all of these stories. And especially, for the past 20,000 years, these are the ideas that have lived on for Coyote, and these are the ones that they evolved with in a lot of ways. Um, so I wanted to talk a little bit about indigenous and trying to focus a little bit more on Abenaki worldviews, and just explore a little bit of the worldviews that surrounded Coyote for so long. So first one is, we are one small part of a whole system, forming it as well as fully relying upon it, right? It's also, the system is a closed loop. There's a lot of imagery in indigenous wisdom in terms of a loop, or a circle that is continuous. There's no beginning or end. Everything that goes around comes around, and that is, how this ecosystem was set. Um, and there's no such thing as a free lunch. Everything that we do has an impact on everything else. You'll start to notice that this is a little bit similar to an idea that's in deep ecology. That's sort of I think it's just called the four laws of ecology or something like that. Um, it was set forth by Barry Commoner, I think is his last name. Um, and it was based on a lot of these indigenous views. And these are really integral to understanding, in especially as we look at this fourth part, just that Mother Nature ultimately knows best, that the system has been honed for billions of years, and that it is something that we come from and we have a lot to learn from. And um, this is something that we see again and again in, all over, Native American culture, but especially in Abenaki and Wabanaki worldviews. Um, and yeah, these are, we've talked a lot about just Coyote's history. In general, we've talked a lot about the last, 5 million years. And we talked about, their relationship with the Native Americans when they came over to North America. And we've seen also just the stories that have been shared about them, that have been cultivated through just thousands of years of observation. And now we've just got one other just small part to talk about, just the last 500 years. Just the last, I did the math, it's like 0.01% of Coyote's history on the planet. We're just going to talk just a little bit about it. So European colonization was a big change for Coyote. Coyote had never seen Europeans before. And like I said earlier, they really didn't even have a concept of the domestic dog, in the same way that Europeans had just been so used to. So this change was very different for them. And we saw this entirely new worldview wash up on the shores of North America, of Coyote's territory, and see how it's changed so much now, looking back. But we have to remember too that these people were ultimately coming from a long history of interacting with wolves, European wolves, right? At first, that we're looking at this story of the Romulus and Remus, the story, the beginning of Rome, was this mythos of, Romulus and Remus being the founders of Rome, and they were raised by a she-wolf. And this was something that, was sort of foundational to this history, to the center of Europe, right? And there's something poetic almost about, and sad about, thinking about what those people eventually over time learned to, how they distanced themselves from their perceived wolfkin, because by the time Europeans came to the New World, most of the wolves in Europe had already been hunted on the verge of extinction, if not totally extinct by that point. There was a lot of just anti-wolf rhetoric that had been so prevalent for so long that it just almost entirely wiped out the European wolf, um, which is just it's so ironic considering where they began, right? And But ultimately it came in a lot of ways, you could say, from, I mean, different ideologies, different experiences, but I think a big part of it also came from the popularization of Christianity and the way that we see Christianity now. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything inherently, you know, negative or malicious about it. But we start to see, once we look at their worldview, how um, how we really start to understand that it isn't that far off to think about, because we look at, the book of Genesis, right? And we see it say things like, God blessed them and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over it. And we see this sort of language come up again and again, where it was it was this sort of um, built-in aspect of their worldview, was that humans, the earth was made for humans, and creation was made for humans to use as we see fit. It was just natural that we were the top species, right? It also created this linear system that was completely separate from the loop idea, from the sort of circular idea of our souls in the afterlife, right? Um, our relationship became linear with the earth, and that the afterlife was an eternity that was outside of earth. Our experience on earth was just a very short period of time in terms of eternity, right? So, and this was obviously something that was, very real to them, and very just as it was to Native American people, right? So this very real idea of, being having this afterlife that you had to sort of prepare for, was something that was entirely different to the way that Native Americans and Coyote had even thought about the world before. There was also this idea that had kind of come up that humanity can't really have a big impact on creation, because God wouldn't allow that to happen. Like, he wouldn't allow his creation to be destroyed. Um, and so there was this sort of removal of, like, accountability or responsibility over creation. And God was also seen as something that was separate from creation. That was, one that he created the universe, but he was not the universe at the same time. And yet he is also the one that knows best for it. And there's again also this sort of another layer of sort of removal of, like, responsibility, and that, like, there's this sort of, like, well, God knows what's best for this. We'll leave it up to him. And it kind of removes this relationship from like, all of these are just sort of steps in terms of, like, separating humanity from the natural world. And what is so it's so different from the way that the coyote had even considered in terms of living, or even Native American people had considered. Um, and this was also the worldview that when the Europeans brought it over to the North American continent, suddenly there was a lot of changes that need to be made. And this is where we see a lot of the effects of colonization. And these are, it's something that it's the hardest part for me to talk about in terms of this presentation, but I think it's also the most important one. Um, and so I'm going to try to keep it brief, but focused. Um, so yeah, so the widespread hunting and killing of wolves in Europe was already a staple in the minds of a lot of the European colonizers that came over. And so this led to the widespread hunting and killing of wolves in North America as well, and that included coyotes. So it started almost immediately after Europeans came here. Suddenly this land was no longer free for any carnivore, let alone game animal, really, for that matter. And everything that the coyote knew about the world suddenly had to shift. The killing could be not just motivated by hunger or by need, but it could be motivated by other things that they didn't fully understand. Um, a life could be taken if somebody felt threatened, even if there wasn't a threat. Sometimes they felt that maybe their livestock were in danger or their pets. So they felt that the best way to deal with that was to kill as many canids as possible. Um, and sometimes it was financial incentives, right? Sometimes it was, maybe it was the livestock, or maybe it was hunting. Maybe it was there were even bounties that were put out in the early days of colonization to kill as many, wolves, get as many coyote pelts as you could, and you'd receive some sort of reward. And there was this whole new level of threat that the coyote had not really experienced before, and that led to just a lot of changes, and a lot of changes in the way that the coyote had to live. Families and packs were separated or killed altogether. With the coyote being such a social animal too, losing a family member to them must be just as traumatic as it is for us, because and we see it in a lot of their behavior too, which we'll talk about later. But the way that it impacts them, especially as social animals, as social hunters, really changed the way that they had to approach everything. Food became a lot more scarce in their homelands, especially in the Southwest, where there was, once the Europeans really started moving out west, there was a lot more just of this, almost all of the wolves were extirpated from the south, and most of them had to move up north to Canada. And yeah, so it put a lot of pressure on Coyote to actually flee, and we'll talk more about where they ended up going. But it was something that was really obvious to Native American tribes that something was wrong. Like there was way too much death, and there were not enough animals around to make up for the loss. And even when Native tribes would try to vouch for the natural world's protection, that just wasn't something that European established governments were quite interested in. And I could talk at length about just that history in general, but there was a lot of wisdom that was ignored for a long time that ended up leading to a lot of just changes overall in terms of how carnivores had to survive, and how they had to adapt. And something that is really fascinating about coyote is their advantages when it comes to resilience and resourcefulness and adaptability, um, which leads right into their fleeing. So as I said earlier, there was this pressure for them to flee, so they expanded their range. So as opposed to just the Southwest, they actually expanded outward both south and north and northeast, which is a lot of how coyotes actually ended up in Maine. A lot of them, you would think that they would come from the southern end, and go up the East Coast, but actually a lot of them went up towards Canada, where there was slightly less pressure from hunters, even though they were going into areas that now wolves had really started to take over. It was ultimately safer for them to go through wolf territory than human territory. So they actually went up through Canada, and they basically had to go through and slowly move through these largely like wolf territories, um, and eventually spread to Maine here. And a lot of them are still obviously in Canada as well. They're still all over the place to this day. But it's really fascinating to think about how, the wolves have been almost entirely extirpated from the United States. I mean, there's some that were slowly now being reintroduced, but at that time, a lot of them were just going extinct here. Whereas coyote, their numbers actually didn't dip in the same way that wolves did, and I'll explain why a little bit later. But I wanted to explore the resilience and the adaptability because one huge perk that coyotes have is that they're really good at finding food, and they're really good at scavenging and just making the best out of a bad situation, for lack of a better term. So they're really good at finding variety of rodents, and ungulates as well, so that wherever they go, they're able to find at least something to sustain them. And also at this time, because of human activity, suddenly there was a lot of places like Maine that used to have wolves, that now didn't. And by the time coyotes were getting there, the deer populations were already, overabundant, and there were a lot of other moose and rodents, and all of the herbivores were starting to overpopulate. And coyotes were just naturally filling in this role that a lot of these carnivores weren't able to do anymore. And this was something that really gave them an advantage in terms of their just ability to adapt and spread. Yeah, so they also would scavenge kills that they didn't make. That's not always the case, but it also just ends up putting them in more conflict with others, including humans. But most of the time they were trying to just avoid places with humans altogether. Like I said earlier, they're a lot more conflict avoiders. They would rather go around, even if it takes the long way, which is kind of, if you look at it, kind of how they came to Maine. And we also were seeing, early farmers, we're seeing these examples where, especially when farmland was starting to really develop, that really also changed the way that coyotes' territory looked. Because there was, especially when farmers were still coming and settling, they were underprepared to build proper enclosures for their livestock and animals. So there was more animals, more game animals, especially in these environments where the coyote doesn't understand our borders. They don't necessarily understand our fencing, or they didn't really even understand domestic animals in the same way that we do, right? So like, to them, that was just a meal that came, especially after having especially long journeys, or having to go through areas where humans had completely wiped out their food source. Suddenly coming across a farm with hundreds of animals, is like coming across a buffet after starving, for weeks, right? Like, it isn't a surprise why there was conflict between coyotes and humans. And ultimately, this is something that we see with carnivores all over the world. It's not just coyotes. This is something that, it's the same reason why cheetahs go extinct. It's the same thing with tigers. It's the same thing there's so many examples of this carnivore human conflict that often takes this shape. And so there's even some evidence to suggest that coyotes nowadays, especially, howl much less. They're a lot quieter when they're near urban areas versus rural areas. So that's part of the reason why people sometimes think they aren't in the cities or they aren't going to be closer to humans. It's actually because we're not hearing them, because they're smart. They know, they've learned, after a long time, that howling near humans alerts them to their position. And so they really did adapt and change so much of their behavior around humans. And even with all of these, these adaptations and their resilience, that's helped them keep alive, right? It's helped them survive, but ultimately they're losing their ability to thrive. And that's, there's a lot of different reasons for that, but pretty much all of them are ultimately the result of human activity. And Now I actually will be able to go into a little bit more detail of why that is, and hopefully not go too much over time. Um, One of the most dynamic and complex parts of the coyote is their reproduction and their social system. And it's also a big reason why hunting them is actually kind of counterproductive, for a lot of different reasons. So when we're looking at it at an individual level, we're seeing that their population, they tend, in a stable population versus an unstable population, we see some of these main differences. So a stable population will see, actually we'll see less pups being born, and typically only a third of them will survive, and that's just due to natural starvation. Sometimes there's miscarriages due to stress, that's specifically starvation or famine induced. So there's also just a lot of cases where pups just, there isn't, in a lot of cases um there's not necessarily like a lot of extra food to go around. There's just enough for maybe one, two, three pups. And The pups are going to be a lot smaller also because of that. And That also means that, in general, when they're smaller and there's less of them, there's more food to go around for all coyote families. So even though there is this threat of starvation, it's this delicate balance of this push and pull so that all coyote families can have some pups survive. And we'll also see that the moms are generally not going to be any younger than 4 years old, a max of like six. And this is actually another really important social thing that they do, where only the alpha females can, and only the alpha, like the two like most dominant in the pack, in this family, can give birth, and the others will physically block the young females from mating, so that only the most experienced coyotes can give birth and train their pups to hunt. And so this is another thing where they've also figured out birth control here. Like they've figured out their whole system of reproduction, to, a T. We also will see a normal curve population. So usually that starts with a small spike of young coyotes, gradually tapering to fewer adults. And that keeps their numbers in balance at a constant rate. And that just makes it easier year to year, for food availability and everything else. Whereas with unstable populations, which is what we saw with a lot of overhunting and this sort of widespread killing of coyotes, they will actually reproduce, they will produce more offspring in these cases because of the stress and the trauma associated with losing family members, especially if there's pups that are lost, or there's a lot of like total family members, total lineages being wiped out. This is something that, as I mentioned in the very beginning, my interest in trauma and the biological aspects of it really comes in the forefront here. And the other thing about this is actually that when there's 6 to 8 pups like this, most of them will actually end up surviving. So there will be more in terms of one pack than there would be in a stable population. And that's primarily because there's usually not as many competition around them from other coyotes, because a lot of those other coyotes are dead. They it's sad but true. They have less competition. And so a lot of times that means that this one specific family will be able to get a lot more food. And a lot of that is also due to the fact that because there's nobody to stop them, a lot of the younger moms, even less than a year old, around a year old, will have all of these pups, and also maybe not always be able to train them properly, because they haven't been well trained themselves, especially if they're also under a lot of stress. It's going to be really hard for them to manage all of that. This also can happen if they lose a mate, because they mate for life. It's really unlikely that they're going to find another mate. So that is just another added complication. And it also means that most of the females that are still alive will try to give birth, because again, there's nobody stopping them, right? And this also leads to an abnormal population where we just see an influx of pups, but not really a lot of elders, because a lot of them end up being hunted or killed. And I also wanted to just point out the life expectancy here, because it's such a drastic difference. Sometimes, in a life expectancy in the wild, it can be anywhere from like 6 to 10. Though in captivity, there have also been examples of coyotes living for 18, 19, 20 years. And the life expectancy when they're in an unstable situation is around 3 years. Sometimes it can be less than that, a max of 6. And that doesn't really even give them enough time to even get old enough to have, a healthy set of pups, right? Like, that is, and that's something that continues to this day. And these unstable populations have been around since, the European colonization. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't stable populations. But it does mean that all stable populations now are kind of isolated islands surrounded by a lot of unstable populations. And we see some examples in Maine of these sort of safe havens, but they're again a lot more spread out. We actually know that Baxter State Park, one of the reasons that Baxter State Park was developed was to be a safe haven for animals. And Governor Baxter specifically mentioned seeing the violence that was being enacted on coyotes and wolves, and wanted to develop some space, save some space for all animals to be able to thrive. And so we actually do see somewhat of a stable population in Baxter State Park, as well as certain areas with private landowners who have figured out how to coexist with carnivores and coexist with coyotes. And we see that with the Farming with Carnivores network, which is a network that is dedicated to helping farmers learn how to manage their farms in ways without hunting any sort of coyotes or carnivores. Because what we ultimately end up seeing is that a place with a healthy coyote population. Like I said at the very beginning, coyotes, there's only going to be one coyote family per territory. And when their territories can be so big, um, what a coyote's family can do for farmers is prevent any other carnivores from entering the territory. Especially other coyotes, they will be able to manage the area. And if they're able to thrive out in the wild, there's no reason for them to go after livestock or pets for that matter. I mean, ultimately, it's more about being able to create barriers for them to not even be like interested in livestock and also being able to um, offer enough of a thriving wild population for them to survive on. That's the big parts of the work that the Farming with Carnivores Network does, but I'm sure there's plenty other details that I don't know about. But these are just some ways that they can maintain stable populations, but obviously both of these are at the hands of humans now, right? And while there's still much more that we have to learn, there's also a lot that coyote can still offer us in these stable populations if we allow them to. Um, so now we get to look at what modern life is for coyote now and what that looks like. And this is talking a little bit more about Maine's laws in terms of hunting. So we have year-round hunting. Basically, there's not really a hunting season for them. This is also something that so Maine has really only had coyotes here since I believe around World War II or a little bit earlier. At least the recordings of them were around the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And people really didn't start talking about them being in Maine until like actively in like a mainstream sort of way until I think like 50s, 60s. So it's still relatively recent in terms of our ecology. But but that being said, coyote had been here, previously, especially in the early days of them coming here. They had been all over the continent. They were even here like during the Pleistocene, I believe. And it wasn't until the glaciers really receded that they started going a little bit more south-southwest. So coyotes have really been here for a long time, and it wasn't until a lot of these changes had moved them away and then brought them back. And Now we're seeing in these modern days of our coyote laws that it's reflecting more of how we would treat an invasive species. But in reality, they couldn't be more native, really. So the year-round hunting is a thing. It's been a thing for a couple decades now. There's also a very low barrier to night hunting. It's the last I checked is around $4 a license. So there's really not a time of day also that's not really safe. I mean, you could technically say that there's no hunting on Sundays, but that's not really, gonna protect anybody, other than just, like people who want to go on walks on Sundays. The Ultimately, there's not a lot of barrier to killing them, and also, like I mentioned later, there's no limits. But this wanton waste exemption is something else that is more about a respect in also in the mindfulness of how we kill or how we take animal lives. This is something that's specific to coyote. Coyotes, this exemption from the wanton waste policy was actually something that was written in later. And I don't remember what year it was, but basically a wanton waste policy is the requirement that hunters use or try to use as much of their game as possible, so all of the fur and meat, or try to sell it. And Coyote is one of the few animals that is exempt from that. So there is plenty of wanton waste of coyotes just being killed and left there. And there's no requirement for anybody to try to use any of that or even, treated as something that needs to be used or sold or anything. And there's no limits, like I said earlier, in terms of like there's no exceptions for pups or females, and there's also no limit really for how many that can be killed. And there's also no necessarily accountability. There's no requirement for anybody to report the kills, unless there's a financial transaction that happens in terms of the fur or meat. But that usually isn't happening because most of the time there isn't a subsistence reason most of the time for people killing them. And there usually isn't an attempt to sell anything. A lot of the time it's just to kill them. And that also leads into the killing contests, which are still currently legal. There are still in Maine, as well as other places, coyote killing contests where people will try to kill as many coyotes as possible for cash prizes or other things like that. And like I said earlier, there's no reporting of these kills, so it's very hard for us to know how many are dying because there's not really a lot of requirement for anybody to be honest about how many they're killing. And people can say what they want, but it's not really scientific. And so that also makes it really hard for people to know how many there are even in the state. And so that kind of leads into the limitations of this current system. Whereas I talked a little bit about earlier, right? The lack of coyotes leads to a lot of overpopulation in terms of rodents and in terms of herbivores, right? We're already seeing an overpopulation of white-tailed deer. And that's especially in areas where there's really unstable coyote populations, because when coyotes don't learn how to hunt from their parents, then they can't really hunt effectively when they grow up. So they're trying their best, but it's a lot harder for them to figure it out, because that's something that they've just always learned socially. And also, there's generally just going to be more conflict with humans. There's going to be a rise in disease. There's going to be a lack of, places for pollinators to make habitats. So it's just going to ultimately end up having this sort of cascading effect of just through all of these trophic levels. And there's also something, as I was doing a little more research into this, looking at the relationship with when there's more conflict with humans and also a higher herbivore population. Sometimes that also ends up leading to more hunting licenses being sold. That's not always the case, but there is just objectively when there's more deer abundant, there's a financial incentive to sell more licenses, which also can be used to kill coyotes, and especially if coyotes keep getting a really negative rap, then it will continue to worsen the problem. So these limitations are a lot, but there's still so much that we can do now, especially now that we all know so much about coyotes, and we've learned so much today. There's so much that we can still do, and that's really what I wanted to leave everybody here with is we need to just first very basically establish more parameters for hunting, if it must be done at all, right? I understand, of course, there's always a self-defense argument to be made, but in most cases, there are nonviolent ways to manage the coyote population. And so establish a proper hunting season, especially to protect the pups and the mothers, just allowing them the time and the safety to be able to train their pups to hunt will help them be more effective on their own in the wild and will keep them from relying on human livestock, or even coming to associate humans with food, because that's really the big thing, is if they are able to thrive out in the wild, they don't have to bother humans. They don't have to even really come near us that much. Um, and so there's this just huge incentive in being able to just be able to protect them for a season, for you know, the at least like the beginning of spring to the end of summer. And It would also be lovely if we could pause the killing contests, especially because that leads to just a large number of coyotes being killed all at once in an area, which is really just unnatural and unnecessary in a lot of cases. And Call for more research as well. I mean, ideally, I would really like to be able to see recordings of when coyotes are actually being killed, because that would just go a long way in terms of research at the local level, being able to understand how many there are in a given area, because like it's already just so difficult to be able to get those numbers. Being able to help them stabilize their population will also be able to allow researchers to get more information on their populations. Yeah, so those are like just the basic things that would help coyote survive. But some of the things that would really help them thrive and really let them live the life that they're meant to live is including them in the wanton waste law, requiring that every kill, that every life that gets taken needs to have some sort of purpose. And even if that's fur, if that's sort of whatever, using those resources as much as possible is just a basic level of respect, and also ideally would encourage a little bit more mindfulness, in terms of just the fact that like this is a life that is being taken, right? Um, it would also be really nice if there was a limit to trapping and dog hunting. There's a lot of cases of people using, full packs of hunting dogs to go and find coyotes, and just giving people just a fully unfair advantage in terms of hunting coyotes down. And A complete ban on killing females and pups would be also great. And Just being able to give them the space that they need to be raised properly, and also a requirement to report the kills that happen. Like I said earlier, just being able to count and know how many there are goes a long way in figuring out what we actually can do to manage them. And so those are some of just like the big things that I wanted to talk about. And also I wanted to end on what is being done right now, because the Coyote Partner initiative that I mentioned earlier is trying to do a lot of this and trying to encourage people to think more about our relationship with the coyote, through our work of education and also our work in democracy. So this is a huge part of the education piece, is talking with all of you and getting to just chat with people more about the life that coyotes live, and educating people on their just incredible role in the ecosystem. And then there's also work that we do with democracy. Like I mentioned at the very beginning, we are trying to eventually pass a bill that would establish a proper hunting season for coyotes, and talking to Mainers about that, and learning about what coexistence can look like with coyotes. That's a lot of what we're trying to do in terms of being able to put that into a bill and hopefully bring it to the Inland Fisheries and Wildlife Committee. And there's a lot that has to happen before that, but we're ultimately excited about being able to advocate for these important keystone species, and talk about, this incredible apex predator that does so much work for us. And a lot of it is really just knowing just knowing what's happening and just knowing what's going on. And thank you all for making that effort, and tonight for sitting through this and learning all of this about Coyote. And that is really such a huge part of all of this work, is being able to as the work of like a Coyote partner, being able to speak for them and for help, and just to help them thrive, is ultimately just the biggest goal. And even if we can make one protection, one little advancement in that regard, then that's invaluable. But yeah, I think the last thing that I had was just a page of resources that I thought would be helpful for people. I mentioned earlier the Farming with Carnivores network, but there's also just some great resources out there, and plenty more on the Coyote Center website, as well as some of these books and this research article, The Ecology of Northeast Coyotes. That one is just a lot more detail. It's a scientific article, but it goes into a lot. And yeah, and these are just some of the great resources that I used to put together this presentation. But yeah, I really hope that this was informative, that this was helpful, and that I explained everything as best as I could. But yeah, I'm just so grateful that everybody could be here. And thank you all for listening. Yeah, if we have any questions, we can move on to that.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Nola. I think that you gave a phenomenal overview of what is a very complex issue with a lot of history. So I think I certainly learned a lot, and I've been working with wildlife for a long time. So thank you so much for that. We do have three questions that are in the chat, and I'm not necessarily going to pose them to you in the order in which they were asked, because I think one of them is going to be a little bit longer of an answer. So we'll start with probably the easier ones first. So the first one we have is, do coyotes kill only for food and protection, or will they kill to protect and expand their territory?
Good question. And I don't know the full details, but my understanding is that they're primarily motivated by hunger and by protection, and really the they're not so much as interested in expanding their territories. They're Once they have a territory, my understanding is that they will stay with that territory, and they don't necessarily need to expand it. But I think primarily the motivations for killing are really just the hunger and the need to feed their families, of course, and the need to protect. But again, even then, a lot of their behaviors in terms of protection are mitigating conflict to begin with. And so I think it's something that they generally try to avoid, but I'm also not the biggest expert in terms of what they like all of their behavior, but I do know, at least in terms of how they generally engage with conflict, is rarely, they're usually trying to mitigate that. But yeah, hopefully that kind of answers the question.
Great. Another question we have is, because you had talked about how there is no hunting at Baxter. And so do we know how the deer herd health and numbers in Baxter differ from the non-protected land that surrounds Baxter? Uh, and then there's a second part to that question, but we can start there.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I honestly would love to know more about that, like the way, specifically Baxter, just because that's such a huge part of Maine's history, and it's just a huge parcel of land too. Um, Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that there is generally less disease in terms of Lyme disease. There's slightly less reports, but it's really hard to tell also because and it's hard to, say that it's because it is very stable there, but there's also the territories can sometimes kind of go in and out of Baxter. So sometimes they'll be on the border of Baxter, but they might not be entirely there. So sometimes when they go outside of Baxter, they're a lot more exposed to threat. And so it's hard to say where the stability starts and ends in terms of their population in Baxter anyway. But with the deer, yeah, I mean, my understanding is that they're slightly healthier, but I again I don't know the details of that. I wish I did though. That would be really interesting.
That leads to the second part of the question, which is who could do a study in that regard? This question was posed in the context of IF&W having a deer yard management program, which currently includes monetary rewards for killing coyotes in order to save the deer.
Yeah, I mean, I think being able to understand exactly just being able to do that research on the coyote population in those stable conditions as well as the unstable ones, I think would give us a lot more information in terms of um, how the deer populations are actually interacting with them. Because coyote also, I mentioned earlier, but they generally are good at keeping herbivores on the move. That's a lot of what their ecological role is. And I think I'd be curious to see even just like the differences in where deer move or how much they migrate in any given context. But I didn't know about the deer management system. That's interesting. I'd also like to know more about that. But yeah, there yeah, there's definitely a lot more research that needs to be done. And I definitely I wish I knew more still. But that's at least what I know about that anyway. Was there a third question?
There is, yeah. So this one is probably the one that's going to be a little bit more complex to answer, but
Sure.
could you share your thoughts on how to have conversations about coyotes with people who don't like them? Because coyotes often polarize people, which is one of the reasons that we wanted to have this talk. And it feels like disagreements about coyotes often dovetail with or turn into culture wars. So on one side, you've got elites wanting to protect them versus regular people who don't, which is ultimately bad for the coyotes. So how would you have these conversations or try to approach these conversations with people who don't like coyotes?
Yeah, and I mean, I I know from it's definitely been something that I've had to learn a lot just over just this past year of especially going into public hearing spaces and meeting a lot of people who have very strong opinions. And I think and it's and I think there's also that comment mentioned something too about um, there's people who are able to vouch for Coyote maybe having more privilege, and I can totally understand that there's some level of privilege just in being able to say that I haven't had any negative experiences with Coyote. I haven't had to I'm very grateful that I've never had any negative associations with them, but I've also just had very little interaction with them in my personal life because of just where I've been in my life. And I that doesn't mean that I don't want to, but that means that also, I don't necessarily have the same negative associations with them that maybe some people who are farmers who maybe have, maybe if they've lost livestock, or maybe people, have lost pets. And a lot of the time, though, even then, a lot of the time when pets go missing, there is sort of a a bias in terms of people reporting those as coyote kills when they've gone missing. There's not any concrete evidence, but there's a lot of negative association, absolutely, and there's and that's not necessarily to say any of that is justified or unjustified, but I do think that ultimately, at least talking with people who are angry at coyotes, who have a hatred or a fear, um, I try to come at it from a level of compassion and education at the same time. I think there's a lot of just unknowns. I think that's a big part of at least why people can be afraid of coyotes in some cases, that they don't know much about them, and they don't, they might not necessarily know how different they are from wolves. They might really not even understand their social dynamics, or their conflict avoidance or anything like that. They just see a coyote and think, oh, I really hope that doesn't impact, I really hope that doesn't attack, I really hope that doesn't go after a pet or something like that, without necessarily thinking about um, the likelihood or the reasons behind or the motivations behind the animal. So I think, like, at least starting from a position of educating and thinking, and also thinking compassionately about where this person is coming from. Sometimes they do have a personal experience. Sometimes it's just that they've heard stories repeatedly that have given them a certain idea of coyotes without necessarily giving them the full context. But it's really challenging, depending, and I think it depends on who you're talking to. But I've found, at least, especially when I was like trying to write a testimony for the Inland Fisheries and Wildlife Committee, that I was really trying to just focus on the the scientific basis of their existence, and the ecological services that they give, because not a lot of people even know that they're a keystone species. And so even just talking about just some of these basic things that they can do for us, they do for the ecosystem, I think really starts to change the way that people think about them. And they may not, at least getting them from a point from seeing coyotes as just fully bad to coyotes as complicated is a huge step, right? And then from complicated to keystone is a whole other step. But sometimes you gotta hold people's hand to go through that, and that's okay. But and I think that's that's part of conservation in a lot of different contexts. But yeah, with coyote, I think especially just that the compassion and the education pieces are, like, at least the starting point, the foundation that I try to start with, and then go from there. But yeah, hopefully that at least answers the question and gives you something to think about.
Mm. Thank you very much for that. And then we have a hand raise from Lily.
Hi. Hi there. Sorry, I was I missed the beginning of the majority of the call here, but just curious if you know anything about any legislation um in Maine that's yet to be decided upon, or if Nola, you and Jerry are looking at working with any legislators to propose new legislation.
Good question. There we have talked recently about getting a piece of legislation going for the 2027 legislature. But in terms of like specifics, we don't really have anything concrete yet. But I know that we'll definitely be sharing more on the newsletter for the Coyote Center for sure. And we also hope to eventually start more communication specifically with the Coyote Partners Initiative, so that people could stay up to date with the democratic sides of things, the legislative sides of things. But very briefly, Maine's system kind of has a every other year legislature. So in 2026, the legislatures like they're only there for a few months. So it's really not practical to try to get anything done during that time. So that's why we're looking at 2027. And hopefully that bill, I think I mentioned earlier, but hopefully that bill is going to be about establishing a hunting season for coyotes. But at this point, we're not really sure uh, who we're going to be working with or what that's going to look like. But that's roughly the goal, and we'll see how that goes. But yeah, but that's a good question, I think. And yeah, thank you for that. I think we're definitely going to be trying to send out more communications as we get that developed. And hopefully that'll help people just be able to stay in touch and keep up to date.
Thank you. If you don't mind just elaborating on the Coyote Partner Initiative, I don't know what that is, and then that's all for me.
Yeah. So yeah, I touched a little bit on it earlier, but yeah, so the Coyote Partner Initiative is this group that we just started this past summer actually. And we yeah, so it is a group where we are working together to advocate for the protection of coyotes in Maine. We do that through this two-pronged approach of education and democracy. So, like you know mentioned earlier, the democracy is one huge part of that, and then the education is the other part of that. Like this presentation, and basically the group is just trying to advocate for the coyote to speak for them, and yeah, we're starting to also try to gather new members. So if anybody is interested, you don't necessarily have to have any specific background, but if you're interested in participating in any sort of educational program with us, or once we get into more legislation and we start sharing more about that, that's also an option. But yeah, if you want to learn more about that and get involved, definitely follow the Coyote Center newsletter, and also reach out to, I think I put it on the other slide. There we go. Yeah, okay, yeah, this one. Yeah, so you can either reach out to me or to Jerry. Our emails are right there. You can also look at the Coyote Lives in Maine website for the Coyote Center, and we have some more information up there, I believe, as well. So yeah, so that's just a little bit about the Coyote Partner Initiative. Yeah, and was there somebody else who has their hand raised? I can't fully see.
There is. Yes.
That's me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, yes.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
my name is Bones. I'm from Cornish. I'm new to Zoom, so sorry for all the no lack of light in here.
Okay.
I have been fascinated with coyotes for pretty much my whole life, and we have this amazing. There's probably about 4,000 acres behind our farm that is doesn't have houses on it.
Wow.
Believe it or not, in Cornish, Leamington, Limerick, and all that. And
Wow.
I've been trailing coyotes for 40 years probably. And I just want to offer that. I don't know if anyone here knows about Cyber Tracker International. It's an organization that teaches tracking and trailing. And we're trying to turn more biologists onto this art that's fading, but it's being revived. And I would be happy to talk with anybody in your group that I learn about our local coyotes just by measuring on the wrinkles on my fingers, the size of their feet and whatnot. And I follow populations, and I pee on top of their pee, and they pee on top of my pee, and they follow me as much as I follow them. and I am just fascinated by them. And I would love to help introduce any biologists or any of your kind of people, because I'm, high school education kind of person, introduce them to this art of tracking and trailing to help in their studies. Because it's, at any rate, just look up Cyber Tracker. It's a funny name. But the cybertracker.org, I think it is, to give you an idea of how this art that's getting lost is being revived and helping with science a lot. And I'd also just be happy to take anybody out and get them fired up about it.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. That's so cool. I did not know about the cyber tracker thing. That's so cool. Yeah, and we touched a little bit on animal tracking in the Maine Master Naturalist program, but I would love to do something more in depth. So that's so cool. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah, and obviously if anybody's interested in that, definitely talk to Bones because oh my gosh, she definitely has all of the experience here. Yeah,
I'm
and
here
like
for
you
you.
said, yeah, I love that. I love that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and animal tracking, like you said, it's such a it's I wish more people knew more about just even just a little bit of it, just because it's such a cool way to learn about animals and also just to get a sense of them in their real like lived environment is just so cool. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That's great. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cyber tracking, awesome. Coyote Partners Initiative, awesome. Are there any other
Someone is
questions?
asking how to contact Bones. So I guess if you would like to drop your contact information, someone is interested in following up with you.
How do you do
Yeah.
that? Do you have to type it in, or can I just say it with my face right now?
You can say it right now. I am recording it. I am recording this presentation. I will send it out to everyone after. So
So it is it's you can text me at 207-252-5720. And then I have a website, but we won't do that one
okay.
because I do a lot of other weird stuff. And you'd be like, what? There
So
it is. Cool. Thanks.
I just put that
Great.
in the chat just in case anybody wants it. And yeah, Stephanie, you can put that in the followed up email too. That's awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for
Yeah,
sharing
it'll
that.
all be in the recording. So
I love that. I love that. Yeah, no, this is perfect. And this is exactly what Coyote wants in general is just people coming together and talking about all of just the wonderful things that they do and getting to learn more about them. That's awesome. That's such a cool opportunity too. I didn't know there was a digital version like of like just being able to learn how to track. So that's so cool.
Well, it's not digital. That's why the cyber name is funny. It's
Oh, okay.
it's very much in person. It's just an ancient word that means something that throws people off. But
mhm.
Mm,
Yeah.
gotcha. Gotcha. It's spelled the same, right? I wrote it down, so I just want
yes.
to make sure.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
okay,
cool. Yeah,
gotcha.
not at all digital. The
Okay,
opposite.
okay, never mind that.
Which one we're
Cool. But yeah,
using game
also,
cameras then?
I know exactly. Okay, all right. Cool. Were there any other questions? Anything?
There are none in the chat.
Okay.
I think we may have asked all our questions. Thank you again, Nola, for this presentation. It was amazing, as always. And as I mentioned a couple of times, this will be recorded. We'll get it up on our website, and I'll send the link out to everyone as well if there's anything you'd like to revisit. Otherwise, feel free to keep an eye on our website, so bangorlandtrust.org. Check out our events page, sign up for our e-news if you want to be notified of any future events. We're still in the planning stage for a lot of our events for next year, but we're really excited about everything we've got in the works so far. So thank you all very much for attending, and have a great rest of your night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.